If you've ever walked past a Brazilian bar around sunset, you know that sound. Glasses clinking, low laughter, a soccer game in the background, and then right from the kitchen the sharp, irresistible crackle that makes everyone turn their head. That's Torresmo Pirorica. Not just pork belly, not just a snack, it's that crunchy little moment that makes people stop talking and start reaching for just one more. Today I'm taking you straight into that barico feeling, but with a method that's clear, calm, and dependable. No complicated seasoning blends, no mystery steps. Because with Torresmo, the result isn't about fancy spices. It's about what you do to the fat and what you do to the skin. Cause and consequence, every step. We're starting with 1 kilogram of pork belly, cut into cubes that feel generous in your hand. Thick enough to stay juicy inside, but not so big they take forever to cook. I season with salt, and only salt. That simple choice matters, because it keeps the focus where it belongs, on technique. Salt pulls a little moisture to the surface, it wakes up the flavor of the pork, and it sets us up for what comes next. Then comes the first transformation. Low and slow cooking, right in its own fat. This isn't the dramatic part yet, but it's the part that decides your future crunch. When you cook the pork gently, the fat renders properly. And when the fat renders properly, the meat becomes tender, the edges start to deepen in color, and you build real flavor without rushing. If you skip this patience, you don't get that balanced bite later, you get chewy, or worse, hard. And I'm going to warn you now, because this is where most people lose the crunch before it even begins: moisture. If the pieces aren't dried before the second fry, the hot oil won't give you bubbles and crackle, it will fight the water instead. In a second, we're going to push it over the edge with very hot oil, and that's when the pirorica happens. Stay with me, and tell me in the comments, what's your biggest curiosity about Brazil? If you like this kind of straightforward, real Brazilian food, subscribe, because the next step is where the magic gets loud. I'm starting with 1 kilo of pork belly, and I'm cutting it into sturdy cubes, the kind that feel like they can handle heat without falling apart. You'll notice I'm not chasing perfect little bites, I'm chasing a consistent thickness so everything cooks at the same pace. Skin on, always. That skin is the whole point, because later it's going to transform from soft and pale into that golden, blistered crackling that makes the room go quiet for a second. Now, seasoning, just salt. I know, it sounds almost too simple, but here's the cause and effect that matters. When you keep the seasoning clean, you can actually taste the pork, and nothing burns or turns bitter during the long cook. I sprinkle the salt evenly, then I take a moment to look at the pieces, making sure every cube has a little of that salt on the surface. If you like this kind of straightforward, botico-style cooking, leave a quick like so I know to bring more recipes like this. And now the method that changes everything: we're going low and slow first. I put the pork belly into a heavy pan and start it over gentle heat. No rush. As the minutes go by, you'll see the meat release its own fat, and that's the foundation. Because the fat renders slowly, the cubes cook through without toughening, and the flavor builds in a way that feels deep, toasted, and unmistakably Brazilian. You'll hear it too, that soft, steady sizzle that tells you the water is evaporating and the fat is taking over. I stir and turn the pieces so they brown evenly, and the edges start to look caramelized, like they're getting ready for the next act. The kitchen smells like a classic bar snack being born, and it's one of those smells that pulls people in from the living room without you calling anyone. Quick question for you while this renders: when you think of Brazil, what's the biggest curiosity you've always had? Food, places, traditions, anything. In a few minutes, I'll show you the step that most people skip too fast, the one that decides whether your Torresmo stays crunchy or goes soft, and then we'll crank the heat for the pirorica moment. If you want to see that transformation, make sure you're subscribed and stay right here. With the pork belly already cut into sturdy cubes, I keep the seasoning almost stubbornly simple: salt. Not because I don't love garlic or pepper, but because Torresmo pirorica is a technique recipe. If the technique is right, the flavor shows up on its own. I sprinkle the salt evenly, then I give it a few minutes to sit while the kitchen warms up and the pan comes to temperature. You'll notice the surface starts to look slightly damp as the salt pulls out moisture. That's not a problem yet, that's information. Moisture is the enemy of crackle later, but right now it's part of what helps the meat start to season from the inside. Now comes the step that changes everything: slow cooking in its own fat. I set the pork into a heavy pan, no oil added, and keep the heat low. At first it looks like nothing is happening. Then, slowly, the belly begins to sweat. Clear fat starts to pool at the bottom, and you can hear the sound shift from a quiet sizzle to a steady, confident bubbling. 'Cause in consequence, right in front of you, the low heat gives the fat time to render without burning, and that rendered fat becomes the cooking medium that browns the cubes gently and builds the deep, porky aroma that makes you think of a bar counter and a cold drink. I stir and turn the pieces so they color evenly. The edges start to go golden, then a little deeper, like toasted bread. The kitchen smells like comfort and celebration at the same time. If you rush this stage, the outside will darken before the inside is tender, and later you'll fry a cube that's crunchy on the surface but tough in the bite. If you're patient here, the meat relaxes, the fat renders properly, and the texture sets you up for the pururuca moment. When the cubes are lightly browned and swimming in their own rendered fat, I pull them out and let them rest. This pause isn't just to cool down. It's the bridge to the crunch. If you're enjoying this kind of clear, no drama cooking, tap like so I know to bring more Batico classics. And tell me, what's your biggest curiosity about Brazil? In the next step, I'll show you the detail that most people skip, the one that decides whether you get a gentle crisp, or that loud, bubbly crackle that makes everyone reach in for just one more, and if you want to catch it, subscribe so you don't miss it. Now the pork belly has done its slow work, and that's not just a pretty step for the camera. Cooking it gently in its own fat is what makes the difference later. The heat melts the fat little by little, and that rendered fat protects the meat while it turns tender, almost confit style. If you rush this part, the outside browns too fast, the inside stays tight, and when it's time to pururuca, the skin won't have the right structure to blister. So let it happen. Listen to the sound, it starts like a soft simmer, and as the fat releases, it becomes a steady, confident sizzle. When the cubes are lightly golden and the pan is full of clear fat, that's your sign. I lift each piece out and set it on a rack or paper towels. And here comes the cause and effect that most people skip. If you don't dry the surface now, the second fry won't be crunchy, it'll be chaotic. Water and hot oil don't negotiate. Even a little moisture traps steam under the skin, and instead of that glassy crackle, you get a tough bite and oil popping everywhere. So I give it time. I let the air do its job. Sometimes I even pat the pieces gently, turning them so every side dries evenly. While they rest, I heat neutral oil until it's properly hot, not warm enough, but hot enough that you can feel it radiating. This is the moment that turns quiet pork into Batico legend. When the first cube goes in, it's instant, the skin wakes up, bubbles rise like tiny balloons, and the surface starts to puff and ripple. That's pururuca. That's the skin expanding because the remaining moisture flashes into steam inside the tight layer, pushing outward and creating those crunchy blisters. I keep the batch small so the temperature doesn't drop, because lower heat leads to greasy Torresmo, and the whole point is light, shattering crunch. As the pieces turn deep golden and the bubbling calms down, I pull them out, let them drip, and you can almost hear them crackle as they cool. If you're enjoying this kind of clear, no-fuss Brazilian cooking, leave a like. And tell me, what's your biggest curiosity about Brazil? In a second, I'll show you the final finish and the exact cue that tells you they're ready to serve. Now, look at what happened after that slow cook. The pork belly cubes are no longer pale and tight. They've turned deeper, slightly golden, and the pot is doing most of the work for you. This is the cause and effect you want. When you go low and patient, the fat renders out cleanly, the meat firms up, and that skin starts drying from the heat. If you rush this part, you don't get enough rendered fat, and the second fry won't have the right foundation to explode into bubbles. Listen to the sound in the pan. It's not a violent crackle yet, more like a steady, confident sizzle. I stir and turn the cubes so they brown evenly, and I'm watching for two things: the edges getting a toasted color, and the skin looking a bit wrinkled, like it's tightening and pulling back. That wrinkling is a clue that it's dehydrating. Dehydration is the key to pururuca. Moisture is the enemy. When they're ready, I take them out and set them on a rack or paper towels, and here's the step that separates good from stop everything crispy: I let them dry. I don't mean just a quick shake. I mean give them a few minutes, and if you have time, even longer. You'll actually see the surface go from shiny to matte. If you drop them into hot oil while they're still wet on the outside, the water turns into steam too fast, the oil temperature crashes, and the skin tightens instead of blistering. The result is chewy Torresmo, and nobody wants to fight their snack. I can almost hear a bot echo around us now, the clink of a cold glass, people talking over each other, that smell of pork and salt pulling everyone toward the table. And right before the big moment, I'm heating the oil separately until it's truly hot, not warm enough, but hot enough that it's ready to react. If you're enjoying this kind of clear, technique-first Brazilian cooking, leave a like so I know to bring more bot eco classics. And tell me in the comments, what's your biggest curiosity about Brazil? Because in the next step, we're going to do the second fry, and that's where the purorica happens, fast, loud, and absolutely worth it. And that's the moment you're waiting for, you lift one piece and it practically talks back to you. The outside is all blistered and golden, like tiny bubbles frozen in time, and when you tap it with a fork you hear that dry, crisp sound that means you did it right. This is the cause and effect that makes Torresmo purorica so addictive. First, the slow cook in its own fat renders the pork belly properly, so it becomes tender and flavorful inside. Then, the second fry in very hot oil shocks the skin into puffing and cracking. Soft where it should be, loud where it must be. I always pause here and let the kitchen settle for a second, because the aroma is pure bot eco memory, pork, warmth, and that toasty note that makes you think of a crowded bar, plastic chairs, and a cold drink sweating on the table. If you're serving, give it just a minute on a rack or paper towel so it stays crisp. And don't cover it with a lid, because steam is the enemy now. Crunch comes from dryness, and dryness comes from respect for timing. I can already hear someone off camera saying, just one more. And that's the danger and the joy of this snack. It's rich, it's satisfying, it's high in protein, and yes, it's the kind of treat that's best enjoyed in moderation, but also the kind that brings people together. Put it in the middle of the table and watch what happens. Conversations pause, hands reach, and suddenly everyone's smiling with that little guilty happiness. If this method helped you finally get that shatter crisp purorica at home, leave a like so I know you want more Brazilian classics with the same clear, no fuss approach. And I want to hear from you. What's your biggest curiosity about Brazil? Is it the food, the music, the daily life, the traditions? Tell me in the comments, because I read them and I use your questions to shape the next videos. And if you want to keep cooking your way through Brazil with me, subscribe naturally, like you'd pull up a chair at the bar and say, alright, what are we making next?